recently I was interviewed as part of a documentary, and the topic of biohacking came up yet again. I get asked about this a lot, and my wife has pointed out to me, she's like, you really sound like an asshole when you talk about this. Like, your total and utter contempt for the field of biohacking just exudes out of your pores. You should really try to be a little bit nicer. And I take my wife's feedback to heart, and I started really reflecting, like, why is it that whenever I talk about this subject of biohacking, or whenever it's brought to me as something to comment on, I just sort of, morph into like angry guy. And so I'll tell you why I think that's happening. And I think there's an important lesson here. So the case that was, the question that was brought to me was the following. We heard about this guy who's, obsessed with, biohacking his way into, immortality. I think he's Australian. I don't even know the details of this guy, but he went to Mexico to do gene therapy using, follistatin and a few other things. And he spent $700,000 to do this. And, we think this is really interesting, and we should be, talking about this stuff. And it occurred to me why I find this annoying. It's not about the fact that the guy is wasting $700,000. In fact, in this particular interview, the person even asked me, "Do you think that these people are frauds?" And I said, that's the wrong question. How do you define a fraud? Is a fraud someone who is knowingly charging you $700,000 for something that they think is bunk? I would say let's even posit that the individuals doing this believe that their magical follistatin gene therapy is going to work. Does that make it any less fraudulent? Forget it. Let's just take that off the table. The real reason that I find these things to bother me, and why I don't want them to be a part of the discussion of certainly what I do, but even this term longevity, is I think it does two things. The first is it certainly sends a message that, if you can't afford a $700,000 follistatin gene therapy, you're hosed. And I mean, we can unpack that for a moment, but let me just tell you, that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. If it was $7, I wouldn't do it. Why? Because there is zero evidence that this works. And by the way, even if it does incrementally, for those of you who don't understand what follistatin is a gene that expresses a protein. That protein then goes on to inhibit another protein called myostatin, and myostatin inhibits muscle growth during development. So the theoretical argument is, if you do this gene therapy to enhance follistatin, make more follistatin, you would inhibit myostatin, you would have larger muscles. Again, you could certainly construct an experiment that might suggest that could happen in animals. There's no evidence it's happening in humans, at least no evidence that I've seen. And by the way, even if it did, this is the point, do you really need to spend money to do that? Or do you just need to go to the gym and lift weights? And this gets to really the second point of why I just find these discussions so infuriating, is it distracts from what really matters, right? What really matters is the stuff that you don't need to pay for, okay? You don't need to pay to exercise outside of maybe getting a gym membership. You don't need to pay to be mindful about how you eat. You don't need to pay to go to bed a little bit earlier and to incorporate some protocols around sleep hygiene and maybe putting your phone down 2 hours before bed or things like that. I mean, the things that move the needle the most are relatively inexpensive. And that's why I get so bothered by these incremental things that at best move the needle maybe a little bit in a TBD way, at worst could actually be harmful, and clearly are a lot of money. Now, you might say, well, come on, Peter, you're just being an extreme, you're reacting to a $700,000 thing. Okay, but I feel the same way about so many of the supplements I constantly am asked about, right? Oh, Peter, should I be taking this supplement and that supplement? And before you know it, a person spending $500 a month on supplements for which there is no demonstrated efficacy. Now, again, it's a free world. And I know for many of those people, $500 a month doesn't matter. Great. But what it does is it distracts people, right? So I want to be clear. I'm not opposed to people wasting money. I'm really opposed to people wasting mind share. I'm opposed to the fact that people think that doing these things is somehow a substitute for doing the things that matter, the things that are proven to matter. As much as one can prove anything in biology, and let's be really clear, this is not mathematics where there are formal proofs, but when you start to talk about things in terms of probabilities, the probability that having a high VO2 max, having solid muscle mass, being very strong, spending time outdoors, having connections with people, the probability that those things are going to lengthen your life and improve the quality of your life is so high that it's as close to being 100% as possible. And yet the probability that this litany of questionable supplements and therapies that people are talking about in the biohacking sphere are beneficial is very low. I mean, we're talking somewhere between 0 and epsilon's a small number. And so, again, a lot of people will say, well, look, I have all the means and the resources to do it, so I'm going to do it. Yes, but again, the more we give air cover to those things, the more we're communicating to other people who might not have the resources, hey, that's where your attention should be. And again, I think that is just fundamentally wrong. So if I come across as a jerk when I talk about biohacking, I hope that this at least explains why, right? I don't think I'm a jerk, but I do tend to respond very strongly to things that are nonsense. I have a very low tolerance for nonsense and buffoonery. It's, maybe it's one of my weaknesses, but nevertheless, this is something that really grinds my gears. And so that's why I get kind of annoyed when I have to talk about it.